Gotta do what I gotta do.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 5 of the MMA Rundown. My name is Ben Gordon. I'll be hosting again. This week was a bit of a down week for MMA. Last week we had a lot of events. We had the UFC going on. World Series of Fighting had an event. There was a big boxing match with Gennady Golovkin, NCAA wrestling tournament, IBJJF Pans. This week, not so much. The only real notable events of the week were a Glory World Series fight on Saturday, which had Sidichai on it as far as big names go there. And then they had the Tanya Evinger championship fight on Invicta. But again, neither of those events really drew a whole ton of interest. And as far as the show goes, I'm not really going to cover either of them. To me, the biggest story of the week was Bellator 180 being announced. So this is their return to pay-per-view, their first pay-per-view under Scott Coker. They announced it this week, and a lot of big names came up on it. So the main event that they're going to be having is Chael Sonnen versus Wanderlei Silva. This fight, of course, was supposed to happen in the UFC. They had filmed a season of The Ultimate Fighter leading up to it. Both had different issues with, it wasn't USADA at the time, I think it was the Nevada State Athletic Commission, with Wanderlei running away from a drug test, and then Chael obviously popping for a handful of different things on his. So that fight never happened, and obviously Chael never fought for the UFC again after that. So this will be the chance for them to finally settle their grudge in the cage. I don't know that Spike TV is really going to be able to go back to any of that footage because it wasn't from the Spike days of The Ultimate Fighter. I don't even know if they have the rights to it anyway. So it looks like they're probably going to have to start from scratch on this, which is a little bit unfortunate. You'd like for them to be able to use all that footage that they had back from the UFC. But again, for the hardcore fans who know what's going on, it's going to be an interesting fight. Obviously, it's not going to be the same as it was back then. It doesn't have any kind of implication on where they stand among the best in the light heavyweight division in the world or the middleweight division in the world, or wherever they contested. I think this one would be at light heavyweight. Their first fight, I believe, was set for middleweight, but again, that's not really all that important now. Co-main event is going to be the rebooking of Fedor versus Mitrione. Hopefully, if anything happens to Mitrione, that either Chael or Wanderlei is able to step in, and that's the fight that gets broken up instead of the Fedor fight, so at least we get to see Fedor fight this time. But again, that fight, it's a big name fight. Hopefully that's going to help draw in some viewers to them, but it's not exactly the most competitive fight. It's not like it's going to tell you a whole lot about who the best heavyweights in the world are. But with the two final fights being fights that have bigger names and bigger drawing power, what I like that they're doing is the next two fights in the card are fights featuring guys who actually are towards the top of their division in the world and some of the best fighters in the world. So the next fight on the card, I believe the order will have Lima versus Lorenz Larkin. So Douglas Lima, their champion, just defeated Andrei Koreshkov, who is coming off a win over Ben Henderson. He's excellent at welterweight. I think he'd probably be making it in the top 15 pretty easily in the UFC if he were there. He'll be fighting against Lorenz Larkin, who was in the top 15, had a great win over Neil Magny, who I believe is in the top 8 right now of the UFC. So, very legitimate guy. Obviously, he's a very exciting fighter to watch. Great striker. He's getting a lot better with his grappling. Still not exactly that offensive with his grappling, but his grappling is getting to the point where it's defensive enough where he can show off that striking game, and the striking game is fantastic. So it'll be a good opportunity for him. I think on the feet, it's not like I don't think he's going to blow Lima away, but it can be a very fun fight regardless. And then the next fight will be Michael Chandler versus Brent Primus. Chandler, of course, coming off a win over Ben Henderson. He's a guy who also has wins over Eddie Alvarez, so we know where he stands in the lightweight division. It's going to be fun to see him compete again. And Primus, I wouldn't expect much out of him, but you never know. It's MMA. Anything can happen. I don't know that they're going to just have a four fight main card. They're probably going to add something on later. Obviously, they've got a lot of events coming up soon. I don't know if they're waiting to see how Michael Page comes out of his fight or any of those other guys who they'd like to put in, but it looks like a really good card. And to be honest, if this was under the UFC name, this is a great pay-per-view. I think fight for fight, this is actually a very good card. The problem for them is the UFC is very experienced in the pay-per-view game, and they've kind of got the brand behind them, whereas Bellator doesn't have that. So for me, what's going to be tough is that I usually don't buy pay-per-views at home. I usually go to bars, and I don't know how many bars are actually going to have this pay-per-view. Anytime there's a UFC event, there's most of the bars in town. You're probably going to be able to find it there and be able to watch it there. Bellator is going to need to figure out their distribution on that and make sure that that's available to them, because if they don't, it's going to take a great event and it's going to make it have lower numbers than it probably should. So hopefully it's available there, and hopefully they put some other good guys on the card. Obviously, another name that we've heard that's going to be on the card is Aaron Pico. Now, the prelims of that event is going to be on Spike. It sounds as though Pico will probably be on Spike. it'll be interesting to see how he does. Obviously, we've seen him just in pure wrestling. He got to the finals against Frank Molinaro in the U.S. Olympic trials in 2016. Split matches with him and then lost in the final match. Molinaro made the Olympic team after losing one match to Pico but winning two, and then obviously finished in the top 5 in the Olympics. So Pico is a world-class wrestler. Definitely going to be great on that side. It sounds like he's a pretty good boxer in the gym. There were rumors that when Josh Thompson was out with a concussion for a while, it's because he was sparring with Aaron Pico and Pico caught him. So it'll be interesting to see where Pico's striking is at. Unless you've been in the gym, you really don't know where it's at. So it'll be good to see his striking in an MMA environment. It'll be good to see that after he gets a takedown, what does he look like on top? Does he just kind of have like that wrestler mentality where he just kind of hangs on to you and beats you up? Does he have really good guard passing? Does he have good submissions? What's he going to do once he gets there? But everything sounds as though he's going to be one of the top prospects to watch. Sounds like he's already very good at other aspects other than just wrestling, and I'm excited to see him compete, and I'm excited to see who they put him against. I don't know if they're going to go against a no-name guy or if they're going to go against someone who's a bit of a veteran, but either way, can't wait to see him fight. Can't wait to see really this main card. Hopefully it sticks together because this is an excellent card. It's a lot better than the UFC 208 card. UFC's 211 card is better than this, but there have been a lot of UFC cards recently that haven't been as good as this card is. This card has 2 championship fights. It's got 2 big name fights on the top of it. It's just going to be a question of how can Bellator handle the pay-per-view side. UFC is very experienced in this, and that's how they're able to do pretty well with it. But Bellator, again, their distribution is going to be questionable. Not sure how well they're going to promote it. People aren't used to expecting a Bellator event on a Saturday. So it'll be interesting to see, but I'm looking forward to it right now. In what's a bit of unfortunate news, word's coming out that John Danaher is likely going to have to go for surgery again, and this time it may keep him off the mats. I don't know if it'll be for good, but it could be for quite a while now. He had a hip replacement recently where in the past couple of years he's been training where he's kind of like had a cane. He's been discussing exactly what's going on the mat, but he's also had some of his top students displaying it during his classes, but that makes it tough for him to teach private lessons, obviously. And it sounds as though if he has to get this knee replacement, he might not be able to roll again, and if that's the case, then that's going to severely limit his ability to make a living through Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but also what he can do as a coach. Now, with George St. Pierre coming back, he still is looking to coach GSP. He's still looking to coach everyone at Renzo Gracie's. He's got his competitive team, the Danaher Death Squad, with Eddie Cummings, Gordon Ryan, Gary Tonin, all those guys that are just competing against some of the top guys in the world and winning a lot of great matches. Obviously, the EBI tournament has been a great showcase for them. So if he's not able to train anymore, if he's not even really able to coach at a great level anymore, it'll be interesting to see how that affects him. I'd imagine that'd probably be worst case scenario. He loves jiu-jitsu. He's kind of built his life around it right now. So for him to lose that would just be devastating, and you'd hate to see that for anyone, let alone someone like Danaher, who's one of the great minds in the sport. So I think right now what the plan for him is, and he had a long Facebook post about it, it sounds like he's going to try to keep fighting through it and see if there's any way he can get around the surgery, but it sounds like from the doctors he talked to, he's going to have to get the surgery. So if he's got his hip and knee replaced, it's going to be very tough for him to roll. He can still obviously be a great mind. He can still kind of like sit from the outside and make great observations, but you wonder how that's going to affect the team, if that's going to mean that he's going to look to push one of his students into a higher role. As far as MMA goes, whether he even gets involved with that or not, or if he just kind of like consults and helps fighters break stuff down. It'll be really interesting to see where he goes from here. You'd hate to see him not be able to coach at the same level he's been able to coach. You'd hate to see him not even be able to roll to the point where a lot of times if you have new ideas in jiu-jitsu and you can't even test them out, how do you really know that they work? So hopefully he gets better soon. Hopefully if they do have some kind of knee replacement, that there's a way to do it where he can still get back to doing what he loves after the healing process. Obviously, as time goes along, these processes get a little bit better as far as how durable the replacements are, how much you can do with them. So hopefully that all works out for him and we see him back soon. The Danaher Death Squad stays strong, and guys like GSP and everyone else training out of Renzo still get the chance to work with him, still improve a lot under his tutelage. Following the NCAA Wrestling Championships, where they started off at 197, we had the 5 weights go on, and then obviously Penn State had their 5 straight weights where they had a guy in the finals and they won all the 5 weights. It seemed like Penn State couldn't really get any better news than that. Having 5 champions, having a guy in Nick Soriano who could have competed for a championship at 125. It seems like their roster's stacked enough as it is. And then news came that Gavin Teasdale, who projects to be a 133-pounder, was committed to the University of Iowa. He came in right alongside Spencer Lee, and it seemed like it was going to be a great 1-2 punch for Iowa. Well, now Gavin Teasdale is decommitted from Iowa and is now going to Penn State. Likely is going to fill a weight class at 133 that didn't even have a qualifier this year. Now, he won't be there next year. He'd be there the year after, and that's if he isn't redshirting his freshman year at that. But again, it makes Penn State only stronger, and it kind of brought up a lot of questions. So for wrestling, their recruitment's been a little bit different than football and basketball and a lot of other sports in the past, and now that's kind of changed a bit to the point where you can start recruiting juniors as opposed to having to wait until their senior year. Gavin Teasdale had made his commitment as a sophomore. He seemed like he was a pretty big Iowa wrestling fan as a kid. He's obviously from Pennsylvania. He had taken some camps with Terry Brands and had made his commitment after that, but it seems as though whether it's friendships with guys like Jason Nolf, who's the national champion for Penn State, or whatever it is, talking to Cale Sanderson, he's decided that he now wants to go to Penn State. And it brought up a big question in the community as far as whether we should be angry at him for committing to one team and then changing his commitment. Should you be angry at Iowa for maybe not still constantly recruiting him until he officially signed and just taking the verbal commitment for what it is? A lot of different opinions on that. Jordan Burroughs seemed pretty upset about it. He felt like Cale Sanderson was being a little shisty in how he was handling that, where even though Teasdale had already committed to Iowa, he was still recruiting him. He was upset that the commitment of saying, yes, I'm going to the University of Iowa wasn't upheld by Teasdale. Now, a lot of things here. First off, everyone likes to say this, and it's fair to an extent, where it's like Teasdale's a kid, you really don't want to dig at him too much. And I mean, I don't know that I totally buy that argument, because again, if you're saying they're a kid, don't be too harsh on them. Well, this is a guy who wrestles in front of big crowds nationally. He's looking to go into college where he's going to be wrestling in front of big groups of people nationally. I mean, if we don't think it's normal for a kid to be ripped on the internet where he can just kind of shut his laptop, what do we think is going to happen when he goes into Carver Hawkeye Arena and gets booed by 15,000 people? I mean, he's in a position where he's going to have to deal with a lot of heat, so getting a little bit of trash online isn't the worst thing. That being said, all he really said is that he is now committing to the Penn State University. I don't actually know what made him change his mind and why he's no longer going to Iowa, and if you don't know the why, it's hard to really dig into him and say that he's wrong. There is some level where even if you verbally commit and say, yes, this is where I'm going to do it, this is my word. Look, if things happen, things happen. I mean, 50% of marriages end up in divorce. A lot of times things seem rosy and then something changes and then you realize, okay, maybe this isn't the best fit. I don't know if him leaving Iowa had anything to do with something that Iowa did. I found it kind of odd that after, or even leading up to the end of the tournament, there was a lot of talk about culture at the University of Iowa, whether it was Thomas Gilman, Corey Clark, even Terry Brands had talked about it, where they were saying that the culture is a lot better than it was. I don't know what that's implying about what the culture was in the past. They were saying there's still more work to do, so what does that mean about the culture now? Maybe at the time that Teasdale had committed, he thought that everything would be rosy, but then he learned something else that we, on the larger scale, don't know. And if that's the case, you can kind of understand maybe why he'd have to switch commitments. Obviously, again, if he's making friends with the guys on the team at Penn State and everything seems rosy there, maybe that's where he wants to go too. I don't know what his reasons are, so to dig at him personally it'd be unfair, because obviously I don't know enough to know whether or not he's at fault here. But it does paint the larger question as far as recruiting goes, whether verbal commitments, what they mean anymore. If that's just kind of like a stopgap where it's like, yeah, this guy did commit to another team, but we can still talk to him and still see if we can change his mind last second. Seems a little bit dirty, but again, until they're signed on paper, they're not technically signed. It's just the verbal commitment is just kind of, the verbal commitment almost is like a marriage thing where it's like 50% of the people who verbally commit end up changing it later. So even if somebody does commit to your team, you still got to keep recruiting them. You still got to keep pushing forward and hope that they stay there. And an interesting thing that came out later that night when he had decommitted was Willie Saylor from Flow had mentioned that it looked as though Roman Bravo Young, who had committed to Penn State, was now interested in changing to Iowa. That hasn't been officially reported on yet. He hasn't officially come out and said that, but that'd be pretty interesting to see how after Gavin Teasdale left Iowa, there are a lot of Iowa fans who are really pissed about people decommitting and all that. And it'll be interesting to see how quick that changes if Roman Bravo Young decommits from Penn State and then goes to Iowa. Roman Bravo Young, again, for this being an MMA show, this is a very specific wrestling recruiting thing. So if I'm going to have to tie this back, Roman Bravo Young has trained with Greg Jackson's camp in the past. He's worked with John Jones. The picture I have in this video, if you're watching on YouTube right now, is him with Holly Holm. But he's I believe he's a 4-time state champion in Arizona, top recruit. He's a guy who's been penciled in either at 33 or 41, depending on what roster he's on. So if he ends up coming to Iowa went from having what looked like a great 1-2 punch in the future of having Spencer Lee and Gavin Teasdale. If you switch that up and now it's Spencer Lee and Roman Bravo Young, I don't think you can be too mad if you're a Hawkeye fan. That's still a great 1-2 punch to have. Both of those guys have the potential to win a national title at some point, if not multiple national titles, especially with the success Iowa's had in the past at their 25 and 33 weight classes, whether it's with your Matt McDonough, your Dan Dennis, Tony Ramos, Corey Clark, Thomas Gilman, you name it. So it'll be good to see what those guys can bring in the future, and interesting to see how wrestling recruiting changes now with all these early commitments. And it'll be also interesting to see now that Penn State has all these champions who have a few more years of eligibility left. Are the top recruits going to still want to go to Penn State and sit behind them, or are they going to start getting spread around and then maybe in a couple of years Penn State isn't the powerhouse it is now? It'll be fun to see. With Bellator announcing their Bellator 180 pay-per-view set for, I believe it's June 24th, they also announced a couple new signings. So again, Lorenz Larkin is getting a title shot on that card. He's one of the new signings who was a UFC, not really a cast-off, but I guess just a guy who got a better offer from Bellator, but a UFC veteran. They also have Michael McDonald, a UFC veteran who had a title shot with Henan Barao at one point. Was a guy who's really talented, a guy who great punching power, pretty good jiu-jitsu. Really young at the time too when he had his title shot. Looked like a guy who could potentially grow into a great contender, but lost to some of the other top guys in the division, including Uriah Faber, and just kind of got to a point where he's in a bit of purgatory, where he's just kind of floating around. Recently lost to John Lineker, so again, not getting his way all the way up to a title shot, but still a guy who you could definitely argue is towards the top 10, top 15 bantamweights in the world. So a great addition for Bellator to get there. They also got Ryan Bader right now. He looks to be setting up a fight with Phil Davis, who's the champion. That'd be a good opportunity for him to win a Bellator belt. I think that's a fight he can definitely win. I believe he won the first fight that those two had. And then outside of that, you've got some of the more recent signings, or I guess less recent signings, with Rory McDonald, who hasn't had his debut yet. He's been trying to get his nose healed up. But it sounds like he's getting ready to step into the cage soon. And then Benson Henderson, who's had a few fights, former UFC champion, who's also signed with Bellator. And it looks like with WME, they're getting to a point where they're, as much as we gave the Fertitta-owned and Zuffa-owned UFC a lot of crap for how they handled the UFC and how they handled signing a lot of these guys, they were still kind of fight fans, and they were making deals here and there that were more just kind of like out of respect for guys than it was as far as what's best for business. If you were one of their guys, you'd get a good amount of money from them, and they really cared about being the organization that had the best fighters in the world, and that was something that they strived to do. I mean, they had some talks with Fedor to give him some ridiculous money at the time when he was free, or when he was freed up. So it sucks in a way that you're seeing these kinds of guys leave. You were kind of worried about WME IMG kind of turning the UFC into more of an event business where they're just trying to go card to card and set up all these money fights instead of doing what's best for the sport, and letting these kinds of guys walk, like your Lorenz Larkin, like a Ryan Bader in a light heavyweight division right now, where you kind of have your top four with Gus, Rumble, DC, and John Jones, but all these guys have already fought each other aside from Rumble and Jones fighting. And once that fight happens, then it's kind of like where you're just kind of spinning them back and forth until someone else gets through, whether that's Manoa, who's fought two of those guys already and lost, or whether you're hoping Misha Serkinov, who they almost let go, whether you're hoping that he's the kind of guy who can work his way in. But Ryan Bader was another guy in there where there were a few fights you could have put him in the top four. He had some pretty big wins with that huge flying knee over Alir Latifi. So let him go. That's obviously not... When you're not re-signing Ryan Bader, it's not because you're trying to keep the best light heavyweight division in the world and be the place where all the best fighters are. It's because you're looking at what he's asking for and deciding, hey, he's not going to draw enough to make this worth it. And to an extent, from a business standpoint, that makes sense. What we saw in the past with Strikeforce is they were signing a lot of guys to some pretty high contracts and then ended up handcuffing them. Their investment group, which I believe, I can't remember what their name was. I know they were investing with the Sharks, or they were the ownership group with the San Jose Sharks too. They ended up cutting bait, and that's when the UFC bought out Strikeforce. So that was a problem for them then. You would hope that isn't going to happen again with Bellator now, where Viacom, yes, they have a lot of money, but they're like any other business that they're saying that the Bellator unit's losing money. they're going to look to cut bait on them too. Just because you have a lot of money doesn't mean that you're okay with losing a lot of money if you have a business venture that isn't working. So I would hope that the money that they're putting in towards guys like Larkin and Bader end up coming back to them. You'd hope that those kind of guys can draw for them and end up being successful. It'd also be interesting to see what other guys head over now, because, again, we just had a week where we had 3 pretty high-profile guys, all guys who were top 15 guys, if not better, that went from the UFC to Bellator. You're having a lot of these fighters, like Joe Duffy even, who's letting his contract run out. I'm very interested to see what Bellator's strategy is going to be on this, whether they just want to sign every top 15 fighter that frees up, how much they're going to pay, what the UFC does as far as keeping guys around. Even like a Misha Serkinov, it was pretty worrisome to see that they would be willing to let him go. It sounds like he was getting pretty aggressive. I don't think he had an agent. It was just him and Mick Maynard kind of going back and forth on that. But again, these are the kinds of guys that you want to have in your divisions, especially if you're the UFC and you're claiming that you have the best fighters in the world. For Bellator, I don't know what their end goal is, if they want to eventually become the Premier League where they want to have the best fighters in the world. If that's their goal, do these signings make the most sense for them to grow that way? Do you want to kind of help grow guys in the meantime? I don't know. I don't know. Obviously, they aren't like letting their budgets free. I don't know how much money they're hemorrhaging or whether they're making a lot of money right now. It seems like putting a lot of money into these guys where the UFC isn't even matching them could be dangerous for them. You don't want them to go down the Strikeforce route, but from a fan standpoint, from a hardcore fan standpoint, I'm certainly more interested in Bellator now. I mean, like I said before, that not Diego Lima, the Lima versus Larkin fight. That's a fight that really interests me a lot, and it's going to be a fun fight to watch. And I'm sure that Ryan Bader's going to have some good fights, whether it's with Phil Davis, will you put him in with Liam McGeary, some of the other guys they have. Maybe they'll bring over some other UFC guys that'll have some good UFC veteran on UFC veteran matches, or maybe UFC veteran on highly ranked Bellator guy matchups. Obviously, the welterweight division's gotten really strong now. Michael Venom Page was a guy we were sort of waiting to see where he could go. It seemed like he was being groomed to become the champion, but now with all the top UFC guys coming in, even like Lorenz Larkin, is Page ever going to get to a point where he can beat those kind of guys? When's he going to get to a point where we're even going to see him against those kind of guys? So with these divisions beefing up, especially the welterweight division, there's a lot that can go on now. It'll be interesting to see how the business does on this end, but it'll also be interesting to see the competitive side, because there are going to be some really good fights that Bellator's going to be putting on. Hopefully the hardcore fans are going to know about it, and hopefully some casual fans are going to see it too. One of the weirder call-outs of the week, Luke Rockhold called out UFC, or former UFC heavyweight champion Fabricio Werdum. Obviously, Rockhold is a former middleweight champion for a fight at heavyweight. It's a fight that, if you think about it from the division standpoint, it's not like it really makes a whole lot of sense. If Werdum loses, Rockhold's not going to use that and then get a big fight at heavyweight next and work his way to the title. Rockhold would only be going up there just as a grudge match. So from a sporting standpoint, it's not like it's a fight that makes a whole ton of sense. Rockhold really wants the fight. Werdum hasn't really discussed it that much. Now his manager, Ali Abdelaziz, has, and he's just kind of laughed it off. It doesn't seem like the fight's going to happen because obviously both sides have to agree to it. Werdum was set to fight Ben Rothwell. Rothwell, of course, got popped with USADA. He seems to be claiming innocence on that, but again, he's not going to be back in time for the fight regardless, so Verdum's looking for someone to fight. But again, for him, it's not like that's a fight that makes sense for him. Now, that all being said, as far as whether or not I think this is an interesting fight, I actually think it's a very interesting fight. If you remember, Luke Rockhold, he's a very big middleweight, so I don't know exactly what he walks around at, but it'd probably be somewhere in the 220s if we're taking a fairly reasonable guess at it, maybe 210 at the lowest, I would think. So for him to be fighting Werdum, who fights at 250, yes, he'd have a size disadvantage, but again, at heavyweight, you've seen bigger size disadvantages. Obviously, if you're looking at college wrestling, Kyle Snyder, who wrestles at 213 internationally, just won the heavyweight tournament and just picked up a giant in Conor Medbear on the way to doing it. So obviously, at heavyweight, sometimes the smaller guy can have the advantage if he has a skill advantage. As far as if Rockhold would have a skill advantage against Werdum, that's tough to say. Werdum, he's very good on the feet, but he's not exactly the fastest. He's kind of like slow and sloppy in the way that he does his stuff, but he still has the kicks, he has the knees and everything else, but he does leave openings. And that almost cost him the Travis Brown fight, to be honest. He won that fight by decision, but it wasn't exactly a fight that he looked great in. He had his moments in the first round, obviously, with the flying kick and all that and breaking Brown's hand, but Brown was a little bit quicker to the punch, and it was starting to show later in the round. Brown did fairly well in that fight. So you'd think with Rockhold, he's relatively quick with his striking. His kicks snap off really fast. His punches can be good at times, although he does like to keep his lead hand down. But it's possible to think of him tagging Werdum at some point. If the fight does go to the ground, Werdum does have the advantage, but Rockhold is excellent on the ground. It's not like Werdum would just roll through him and just submit him immediately. I feel like if Werdum got him to the ground in one of the rounds, it's a very real possibility that Rockhold survives the round. Now, granted, he'd probably be outpositioned and lose the round pretty noticeably, but I don't think that he would automatically just get tapped out just because Werdum's on top of him. So, honestly, if that's the fight that they want to make, I would enjoy it just from a standpoint of I kind of want to see how it goes. I think Luke Rockhold has a very real chance to win. I wouldn't pick him to win, but I think he has an actual shot at doing it. It'd be a fun one to watch, but I don't know what they're going to do on that end. So again, Werdum, he doesn't have an opponent right now at heavyweight. I don't know who they'd give him with Rothwell backing out. Rockhold is in a division that has just been completely ripped apart by Michael Bisping. As far as who he would fight, he was set to fight Jacare at a point, and then he had to pull out of that fight. Hasn't fought since. Jacare now has his fight with Whitaker and was talking about possibly retiring if he doesn't get a title shot next. So if Jacare does beat Whitaker, would he even take a fight with Rockhold? That's questionable. Outside of that, do you give Rockhold Yoel Romero? That's a possible fight you could do, but again, I don't know what the UFC's plans are with Yoel Romero. It sounds like they have something brewing with him. Maybe Rockhold is the plan, and Rockhold is just kind of throwing out Verdum's name just to distract us. I don't know what's going on with that, but if Yoel Romero and Jacare Souza aren't going to fight Rockhold, I don't really know who Rockhold should be fighting right now, especially with Kelvin. Kelvin might have been one of the guys where it's like, okay, maybe Rockhold, he's been out a while, hasn't fought. By the time he fights next, it'll probably be over a year. Like, you give him a guy like Kelvin Gastelum maybe, but now Kelvin's tied up with Anderson Silva, and Anderson Silva, if you want to talk about him fighting Rockhold, again, same thing, he's tied up, so it's not clear who the best option would be in the middleweight division for Rockhold to fight next. And as far as Werdum goes, with Ben Rothwell out of the picture, I mean, are they going to try to like put him and Ngannou together? That'd actually be a very interesting fight. I think might be a little bit too soon for Francis Ngannou to put him against a former champ and a guy like Werdum, who's going to have a pretty significant technical advantage on the feet and also on the ground. But again, if that's the fight they make, that's a pretty interesting one too. Because again, like I said, Werdum isn't the fastest guy. Even though Francis Ngannou isn't the most technical guy, he can be quick and he can be powerful, and he might actually land a hard shot on Werdum and be able to put him out. You'd have to pick Werdum in that fight, but that's a fight that Ngannou could win too. So I don't know what's next for either of these two guys. It seems like Fabricio's side is saying no to the Rockhold side, but if they do make this fight, I'd actually really want to see it. Even though it makes no sense from a sporting standpoint, as far as at least the divisions go, I think it'd be a fun matchup to see. Back in 2014, an amateur kickboxer, Dennis Munson, who had been training under Roufusport, had fought in his pro debut, he just fought in his debut fight. I don't remember if it was pro or amateur. After losing that fight, he also lost his life, and there had been an investigation that had gone into that. The local newspaper, the Milwaukee Journal-Constitution, had actually put out like a 10-minute video on it that was pretty damning if you watched it, where you could see that the referee wasn't really paying a whole lot of attention in the fight. The ringside doctor wasn't paying a whole lot of attention in the fight. Even his cornerman wasn't paying a whole lot of attention in the fight. Just to give a quick recap on what happened with that. So he came out in the first round, looked all right at the start. I mean, he was in it. It was pretty competitive. But by the end of the first round, he looked, if you didn't know better, he looked like he was gassed at the very least. Like he wasn't moving very well. He looked really tired, really slow, wasn't really punching very hard. His opponent didn't really seem to be all that aggressive about it either. That's probably the weirdest thing to me, is that after the first round, Munson, you could tell, was pretty much done out there. Now, granted, for the doctor and for his own corner, you should probably start looking to throw in the towel. Probably not at the end of the first round, but at least at the end of the second, once you see your fighter going that way. But it's surprising that the other fighter wasn't able to put him away. But that's not really the point here. Second round comes around, he's stumbling around a little more, having trouble getting off his stool. His cornerman, Scott Cushman, who has been cornering a lot of UFC fighters out of Roufusport too, doesn't really seem to pay too much attention to it. He gets out there, puts together a really bad round, just really slow, wobbling around out there, gets through it. Second round ends, referee isn't really paying a lot of attention as he stumbles to his corner. They go out again, same type of thing. Again, not a good look out of Munson, not a good look out of the doctor, who was looking at his cell phone at the time. He goes out again, finishes the round, finishes the fight, loses the fight. But he wasn't looking right, he wasn't feeling right, and afterwards he went to the hospital, and ultimately his life came to an end. So this had happened back in 2014, and just this week, his family decided to sue Roufusport over this. Now again, Roufusport it was Duke Rufus's promotion that was putting on the fight. Again, his cornerman, Scott Cushman, was a Roufusport coach. The doctors, I believe, worked with Roufusport too. So I think everything throughout this was under the umbrella of Roufusport. And there are two things to look at here. So there's the court of public opinion, and there's obviously the actual court. If you look at the video that the Milwaukee Journal-Constitution put out, it's damning. It looks really bad. I mean, even if you don't know anything about the sport, the worst thing you could say is that his corner just let him go out there exhausted and put him at risk. But it's worse than that. The signs he was showing go a little bit beyond just physical exhaustion as far as like being gassed out. I mean, he was wobbling around, didn't really seem to know where he was just kind of like fighting off his instinct at that point. And his cornerman really should have stepped in. The doctor should have stepped in to check. The referee really wasn't paying attention. And from that standpoint, that's a very bad look. I think if you're in the Milwaukee area and you're looking to train in kickboxing, become a kickboxer, even become an MMA fighter and do some kickboxing fights in the meantime, it's definitely going to make you wary about training with Roufusport, but also even competing with them, because it's not everybody who competes in their promotion is actually someone who trains at Roufusport. They're not all just Roufusport versus Roufusport fights. So for that business, that's going to be a bad look anyway. And I think if you're a fan of kickboxing in the area, I don't know if you're going to want to go to one of those events either. So that could hurt the promotional business. But even aside from that, as far as the actual lawsuit goes, again, it looks really damning based on the video they have. Now, one thing you have to consider is that for a lot of these gyms, both as a member of the gym, but then also as a fighter, you're signing a lot of waivers. And without knowing the language of the waiver, it's hard to say who's legally going to be liable and whether or not the waiver is even something that's going to count. Because sometimes people will sign a waiver and then the court will decide, well, there's no reasonable way they would have known what was in it, or they would have understood that this is what they were risking. So sometimes that doesn't even count. But I know in the past, like for things for different tournaments I've competed in, or just even going to my gyms, obviously I have waivers to sign there. I don't exactly read through the language specifically. I understand that when I'm doing it, that, hey, if I sign a waiver and I go to this gym and I get my arm, so here's an example, like I mess up my UCL, or my ulnar collateral ligament, which is the Tommy John ligament. I've had a few injuries with that, both in my left and my right arm. Like, I understand that I'm not going to go back and sue the gym owner once that happens. Like, that's just kind of a risk that I'm taking by training there. So there are things like that I think are pretty well assumed under the risk. So again, with Munson, if he gets knocked out or something normal under a fight happens, I don't know that the promoter is liable. This, again, depending on the full language of the waivers, I don't know what they put in their waivers. There's a chance that legally they might not be liable for this, and they might have a case, but whether or not they legally get lost, or they legally lose this lawsuit, and whether or not Munson's family gets a big payout from it, I think this really is a bad look for it. And I hope that fighters in the Midwest area are going to pay attention to this and really look not to compete under the Roufusport banner. And even if they're not even competing under the Roufusport banner, there are a lot of regional promoters who are fairly new to the business or aren't exactly all that experienced. And you want to learn from what happened to Munson so it doesn't happen to you. So even if you're cornering a fighter, whether it's in the Midwest or anywhere else, and they're looking bad on a fight, try to remember what you saw in the video with Munson and say, hey, my guy's kind of wobbling around. He's not looking good out here. Even if it's not his debut, like, you want to live to fight another day. Like, he's not looking good. This fight, he's not making any money out of it, or he's not making much money. Like, maybe we should throw in the towel. Maybe we should kind of pull it early here, and it'll be worth it in the long haul. And I think if that's what comes of this, even if the Munson family loses the lawsuit, which they may have a very good case. Again, I'm not a legal scholar. I don't know what the waivers say. I don't know everything that's being considered in this. Obviously, from the case that the Journal-Constitution makes, it looks very bad for Roufusport. But either way, I think the MMA community has a lot to learn out of this. If one of your fighters are looking pretty bad, don't be afraid to throw in the towel. Obviously, the ringside doctors, don't be looking at your phone between rounds. Pay attention to the fighters. These are the kind of things that can really hurt the sport and hurt the growth of the sport. Yes, we're in all 50 states, but there are still some countries that won't allow MMA to be sanctioned. There are countries that aren't allowing kickboxing to be sanctioned, including Canada. And when things like this happen with Roufusport, it doesn't just hurt Dennis Munson. It doesn't just hurt Dennis Munson's family. It doesn't just hurt Dennis Munson's friends. It hurts the whole sport. So hopefully we can use this as something that we can learn off of and just kind of grow forward and not see this happen again. The California State Athletic Commission has proposed, I think it's a 10-point plan as far as how they want to go about limiting weight cuts and really cracking down on fighters cutting weight. A few of the points that they were looking at is increasing the number of weight classes. They're looking to go every 10 pounds on integers of 5, so it'd be 125, 135, 145, 155. And then they'd have 165 instead of 170, then 175, 185, 95, 205, 225, and then 265. So they're looking at an addition of weight classes. They're looking at doing some more weigh-ins. So they're weighing people in 30 days out, weighing people in the night of the fight, trying to keep it, I believe, a 10% variance. So you can't be any more than 10% higher than what you weigh in at. If you are, it doesn't sound like they'd be canceling the fight, but they'd probably fine you and then not let you fight at that weight class again until a doctor can prove that you can make the initial weight. A lot of these things actually sound pretty good. I'm definitely on board with the idea of getting rid of weight cuts. Now, obviously, with weight cutting being what it is at the point that it is right now, there's going to be some point where if we're going to make these kinds of changes, there's going to be some vast changes that are made. So, again, a lot of the fighters who are champions at their weight classes right now, like I think Demetrius Johnson, if he is 10% ahead of 125, I think that would be 137.5 that he'd have to be walking around, and I think he walks around in the 140s. So he'd probably have to move up in weight, and he's not even that big of a flyweight. You'd be looking at that a lot of weights where guys who are champions at a certain weight are going to have to move up if this comes into effect. But that's something that's going to have to happen, and it's really something that should happen. The problem that they're going to have is right now this is just California, and this is something that California is looking at. Now, if California decides that this is what they're going to do, but no other state does, they're going to be handcuffing themselves because, again, so let's just use Mighty Mouse as an example, but there are better examples. Luke Rockhold isn't the champion anymore. I'm not sure what Bisping walks around at. Let's see. Woodley most likely is above 190 that he walks around at. So let's just say that Tyron Woodley, he's the champ at 170, and he was going to have a title fight in California. Well, now all of a sudden, in Las Vegas, he's allowed to be the welterweight champion, but in California, he's not, or in California, they're going to change it. Right now, that's going to be the biggest concern is that I like what California is doing, but it has to be something that's going to be adopted by every state in the country, because otherwise you're going to have guys like a Tyron Woodley, for example, who could be a welterweight champion in Las Vegas but couldn't be in California, and that really doesn't make any sense. And again, the addition of weight classes too. Like, are they not even going to let Woodley fight for his title because they don't recognize a 170-pound champion? Would they force him to fight for the 175 belt and force the UFC to start changing stuff around? Again, I like the idea. I think this is something that at the lower ranks, they're going to have to kind of test out and prove that it works, maybe on some of the amateur shows. But if they can, maybe a couple of years from now, we revisit this, the UFC accepts it, and all of a sudden you've got some new weight classes. And really, I know Dana White likes to talk about how he doesn't like adding weight classes, how they've talked about adding women's strawweight at 125, and he doesn't want to do that. Or actually, no, strawweight's 115. At women's flyweight, he hasn't been eager to add. But we've seen lately that WME is happy to throw belts around and make belts up and put up interim belts. If you're going to actually have actual divisions that you're building up and actual championships, so now all of a sudden, instead of having a bunch of interim belts, you have a bunch of real belts, but there are more weight classes. I don't know that that's something that they're going to be against. Dana may be against it, but Dana doesn't have the majority control of the company, and it doesn't seem like a lot of the stuff they've been doing recently is stuff that he'd want to do anyway. So this is actually something that could benefit the fighters. It could benefit WME, IMG, because they're going to get more champions. They're going to have more title fights that they can promote. And hopefully it's something where a lot of these fighters who cut a lot of weight aren't going to have to cut a lot of weight anymore. Because let's remember, the Nate Diaz versus Conor McGregor fights, those were two of the bigger fights of the year back in 2016. And nobody's talking about it now where it's like, yeah, but they were fighting at 170. Like, I don't give a shit whether they're fighting at 155 or 170. I want to see them fight at their best. And quite frankly, Conor versus Nate at 170 is going to be a better fight than Conor versus Nate at 155 because both of them are going to be able to spend more time in their camp towards actually working on their technique than towards making sure that they're on weight. And that's time that gets wasted. And that's really not even good for the sport itself. I mean, not only is it bad for the athletes to have to make these harsh weight cuts, but when you have a lot of these fighters who, a lot of them already are mostly training just in camps now, like they've gotten to a point where their skills are pretty much what they're going to be. And they only seem to really train when they're in camps. So you remember, this was one of my pet peeves too with the Chad Mendes versus Conor McGregor fight when Mendes stepped in on 2 weeks. And Team Alpha Male was talking about, oh, well, Mendes was only training for a couple weeks. He was out hunting in the meantime. And it's like, if you're a professional fighter, really you should be training the whole time and kind of treating it as a martial arts thing, even if you're not just going balls to the wall. If you're just kind of working on techniques, doing some drilling and getting into the gym, even if you're going like 5 days a week as a professional, I mean, that's something you should be doing. But a lot of fighters, as it is, they kind of stay out of the gym. Then once camp comes around, that's when they start coming in and they start doing 2 days and 3 days and working their ass off then. But for guys like that who've just been doing camps as it is, with them having to watch their weight on top of it being the camp, like they're really not improving the whole lot, and it's not really the best for the fans. So if you're taking weight out of it to the point where it's like, we've kind of drilled down what size you are. This is the size you're going to fight at. Now when you're in camp, you're just going to be focusing on fighting because you don't have to worry about dropping 20 pounds or 30 pounds over the course of 8 weeks. It's going to be good for the fighter's health. It's going to be good for the fighter's technique. And ultimately, that's going to be good for the fans, too. You don't like watching guys who've just kind of killed themselves in the sauna the last week, step into the cage and only have like a good round and a half in them. So this will be good for everybody. Hopefully this works on the amateur level. Hopefully it works on some of the pro levels in California. And hopefully this is something that gets adopted nationwide if everything works out. But that's really that. In the past, I've talked a lot about how I like fighters who can put on good promos. I've talked about how sports isn't just its own industry. There's not just the sports industry. It's the entertainment industry. It's a subset of the entertainment industry. And as a fighter, you're not just an athlete, but you're also an entertainer. And you're also trying to sell the fight. And being able to sell your fight is going to offer a lot of value for you. It's going to help you make more money when you're working on the card. And it's going to really help the company and have more companies actually want to work with you. So, again, in MMA, there aren't a whole ton of guys who do a great job of promos. There are some guys who've done great in the past. You got your Chael Sonnens, your Conor McGregors. But what I'm going to start doing every week, whether it's an MMA promo, whether it's a WWE promo, whether it's from another sport, whether it's just something more in general, I'm going to play what I call my promo of the week. It doesn't necessarily have to happen that week, but it's just a promo that I like that given week. Let it play and kind of break it down. So the one I'm choosing this week, last week I had a thing where I was breaking down the fight between Alex Jones and Alec Baldwin if they ever fought. Did the whole left hand or right hand A-bomb, left hand gay bomb thing for Alex Jones. But he did a fun little thing on his show where he just went in deep on Alex Jones. Obviously, for an MMA fighter, I don't think you want to get as gruesome as he got, but I like the intensity, and I think it's definitely something that you can learn from and take. And even though it doesn't seem like it's completely serious, that's something that could be fun, and hopefully some MMA fighters are listening to this and can try some of this out for their next fight.
You can't have a car or house, but Alec Baldwin can. Alec Baldwin is a selfish, bloated pig. Alec Baldwin isn't worth my fist upside his pathetic face. He's a talented actor. I won't lie about that. I've liked Alec Baldwin. When I see him in movies or TV shows, I can't watch it now because I realize what a piece of crap he is. Alec Baldwin thinks he's a tough guy. I challenge him $1 million, the charity he wants, to get in the ring with me. Bare knuckle. I will. I'll do it right now. I'll get in the ring with you, and I will break your jaw. I will knock your teeth out. I will break your nose, and I will break your neck. You coward. You think you're a tough guy messing with little cameraman people. You want to sit there and defame me and the president. Get in a ring with me. I will break your jaw in seconds. I will smash your nose into a bloody pulp, and I will rack your teeth out. My fists are going to be bleeding with your teeth marks all over them. You frickin' bully, you coward. I hate you. My listeners hate you. And remember that scumbag forever.